I tried Hadean Tactics the first time before it released in early access and found the game to be okay, but a little shallow. I came back to this game for its 1.0 full release, and I've been really enjoying it since then. I actually played this game for 6 hours straight the first time I booted it back up, so let's get into it. Hadean Tactics is a roguelite with a unique mix of auto-battler and card game elements set in the underworld. Most of the time, the game plays like a turn-based game with periods of auto-battling between them. The fights take place on a small grid map where your team of heroes and allies attack enemies. Between fights, you can navigate a simple, branching, Slay the Spire-like overworld with a fairly standard mix of fights, random events, merchants, and other upgrades and buildcrafting mechanics. And all these mechanics allow you to modify your deck, upgrade and change your units, as well as collect various relics that modify your team and your cards. There are 3 default heroes, as well as a custom hero that we'll talk about a little later. Each hero has their own deck and playstyle, as well as 3 different variants that focus on different aspects of that deck and playstyle. For example, the Archer hero focuses broadly on poison damage and laying traps. One variant focuses more on that poison mechanic, while another variant focuses more on activating traps and other trap mechanics. Heroes and other units in the game all come with stats, an active ability or spell, and passives called alliances. Stats do pretty much what you expect them to do, and they give the hero their health, attack speed, mana, things like that. The unit's active ability or spell is automatically triggered when that unit's mana bar fills up. This bar is usually filled up by passive mana regeneration that every single unit has, but certain cards and abilities can affect that as well. These active abilities can range from summoning more allies to dealing massive damage to enemies, to providing a powerful buff or shielding effect to their teammates. Finally, each unit has one or more of those alliances, those passive abilities, that modify all units in the fight while that unit is alive. These are usually pretty small buffs, but they can create some powerful synergies. As you go through your run, you recruit more units, level them up with more stats, spells, and passives. You can also move them on or off your main squad to allow them to heal better, or in order to better counter certain enemies that you come across. Units have multiple upgrade paths that focus on different aspects of that unit. For example, one upgrade path might focus on that unit's damaging active ability, while the other upgrade path might focus on that unit's basic attack damage. The same principle applies to your main hero, but they have more unique upgrade paths and more unique options. If you've played other standard auto battlers like Teamfight Tactics or Auto Chess, you've seen a lot of these core mechanics and elements that are there. Hadean Tactics doesn't necessarily innovate with new auto battler mechanics that you've never seen before. That being said, I think the elements are done really well in Hadean Tactics, and they give the game a solid core gameplay and foundation to build upon with cards. You have to balance a good team composition with some tanking and shielding, as well as good forms of dealing damage. And you have to think about how those units synergize with each other, as well as your cards and your deck. You might have 3 summoner units that all get stronger for each additional ally summoned. And that can create some really fun power scaling that feels like you're breaking the game at later stages. It's worth noting though, that while this combat is 90% an auto battler, there's a capacity for a small amount of unit control. More specifically, you can choose what enemies your units target a couple times per fight. And that can be helpful to target high damage, low health enemies first, before targeting high health, low damage enemies, and things like that. Classic target prioritization. I enjoyed this small extra level of control, and it's mostly nice to prevent your units from doing really stupid targeting, but it's not enough control to make it feel like a micromanagement heavy game. Additionally, some cards or unit abilities can stun enemies, and that causes them to reset their aggro and targeting in a way that pure auto battlers wouldn't have. And on that note, let's talk about the card game elements. The general cadence of Hadean Tactics is a turn of playing cards, 7 seconds of gameplay with auto battling, and then another pause in turn where you play a new hand of cards. You can actually pause the game at any point in time in order to play those cards, but most of the time, it's best to play all of your cards immediately. The core card playing mechanics will feel very similar to you if you've ever played any roguelike card games. You draw cards each turn that have energy costs, and you have only 3 energy points you can use each turn in order to play cards. As with other similar games, you can modify your draw power, the amount of energy you have each turn, modify your deck with rewards after fights, those same mechanics you've seen in every other roguelike card game. The cards themselves in Hadean Tactics can either directly synergize with your units or act independently. For example, some cards give units shield or give units might, which increase the damage of their next attack. Other cards independently damage enemies or summon additional allies to the field. You can also create some nice tactical elements where you choose which of your units is the most important to shield, or which enemy you want to kill first, and prioritize. And there are even some fun cards that allow you to throw enemies around into each other to deal massive damage. As you might expect, there are a lot of potential combos between your units and your cards. Units all have those various passive effects called alliances that I talked about. While these passives often affect the units themselves, they can also synergize with cards in fun ways. Some alliances, for example, will buff your spell cards, or make it so that playing spells buff your unit. Using that same summoner example that I talked about earlier, if you have units that get buffed every time you summon an ally, and you have cards that summon more allies, that can create some fun and powerful combos. As the final piece of your build, you can also collect relics in this game, which are powerful items that give you passive buffs. These are generally some sort of stat buff to your units or your cards. They can also be more unique. These relics can be important for creating strong combos, like one relic that allows you to create additional ally for every couple allies that you summon. As a whole, I don't think the deck building or the card game mechanics in Hadean Tactics are reinventing the wheel. They're familiar, but they work well. The real joy comes from how these cards mesh with your units and how you can build craft with your hero variant that you chose. For example, the one variant of the Archer hero focuses on applying poison. So I had some really fun builds where I had my poison applying hero mixed with poison buffing cards and relics. I had some fun builds where I had a lot of summoning and damaging spells. I had other fun builds where I focused exclusively on buffing my hero to make it an absolute tank that dealt a lot of damage. I do want to mention and expand on the custom hero here too. This hero can have any of the standard unit passive abilities, combo with the passive abilities that are stronger and more unique to heroes. This can allow you to create new builds and new combos that can feel overpowered to the point of being busted. You can also customize that hero starting deck, which again just allows some new combos and playstyles. There are some limits to the custom hero system in terms of allocating stats, as well as the power of the starting deck. And there's also a minor progression system specific to that custom hero. I like this custom hero's existence, and it just adds more flexibility and more playstyles. That said, I honestly didn't play around with it that much and preferred to just use the variants of the stock heroes. I will also say that while Hadean Tactics is not a buggy game, there are a couple relics and mechanics that never seem to work for me. For example, one relic claims it will deal damage to enemies if you don't spend all of your energy on a given turn. But I never saw this relic actually deal damage, even when it should have. And really, none of the bugs I encountered were ever game-breaking, and they were easy to avoid. For example, I just stopped picking this relic. But I did notice them, and they were occasionally there. Oh, and Hadean Tactics has great Steam Deck support. It can be played with multiple different control schemes that all worked independently well. It was definitely slower to use a controller versus a mouse because of how targeting cards and spell abilities worked, but it works really well, and I used it last year while traveling. Finally, I want to talk about the run lengths and run types. This is arguably a minor spoiler, so timestamp listed if you want to skip ahead. I don't really consider this a spoiler though, because the game strongly hints at this mechanic from the very first run. Regardless, runs can come in two different lengths. The initial ones are 3 areas or circles and last about 45 minutes. Once you unlock the ability to do longer runs, the runs are 6 areas or circles and last an hour and a half to 2 hours. The main reason I want to talk about run length is that the shorter runs have a different feel than the longer runs. Most notably, there are certain limits in the first 3 circles, like how many times you can upgrade each unit, the number of units you can have, to make the game feel more fine-tuned and more balanced as a whole. In that sense, it felt to me more like a Slay the Spire-like balance system for those first 3 areas. The longer runs that go to the 4th, 5th, and 6th circle start to feel a lot more open-ended. Your units can get very powerful, and your synergies can start to go off the wall. This can be super fun and create scenarios where you feel like you're really breaking the game or completely filling the board with summons, for example. You can stack enough poison to instantly kill bosses in seconds. In that way, it began to feel more Monster Train-esque to me, where absurd combos were both possible, but eventually started to feel required in order to climb difficulty levels that we'll talk about later. All of this is just to say that Hadean Tactics, depending on the run type or run length you pick, can satisfy different playstyles with the overall balance and feel of the game, because of how that scaling works in those later circles. Now let's talk about variety and randomness in Hadean Tactics. As a whole, Hadean Tactics has a lot of familiar RNG mechanics that make each run feel different, but so many important elements are controllable, so the game never feels like it's punishing you for bad RNG. The randomness mainly comes in 2 places. The first is the standard card game randomness in regards to what cards you draw and when, and if you've played any card games before, really any card game roguelite specifically, you've gotten a feel for this and know if you like that or not. The second form comes in randomness in regards to rewards and events you come across. As is also standard in the genre, you can choose between a couple options or reward choices. You can also choose to refuse a reward if you don't want it. You can always work with what you've got, but you're also forced to not always run the same units or same cards each time. You also run across shops pretty often, which give you a lot of ability to buy specific units, relics, and cards, and are a great counter RNG measure. Some relics are very powerful for certain builds, so that could be an important factor for you as you start to climb those difficulty levels, but I never felt frustrated by not being able to get a specific unit, card, or relic. It's also worth noting that each hero can ban specific units from appearing on their run, and this serves as another additional counter RNG measure that helps you out. One thing that's important to note is that a lot of run-to-run variety is decided from the start of your run. Each hero variant focuses on one or two hero-specific mechanics. So generally you know from the start which cards, which units you'll want. You can absolutely have some flexibility within each variant, but too much flexibility can quickly make your build very bad and make you lose that run. In short, if you pick a spell-focused hero, you're probably going to want to pick some spell cards and other spell buffing units. There are different types of spells, different spell interacting units, but you're not going to randomly pivot to a poison build mid-run and expect to have success. In that sense, you could argue there are really only 9 build types because of each of the hero variants. You could also argue there are even less than 9 build types because the different hero variants for the 3 heroes all have some overlap and share the same potential cards. I do wish there were some more build archetypes or broad types of builds. And I would say that's probably the biggest flaw in Hadean Tactics that I encountered. Each broad build type has fun flexibility within it because of all the moving parts, the different units, cards, relics, your heroes, and how they all interact with each other, but more broad build types would have elevated this game and given it a lot more longevity for me. The custom hero does help with this restriction by giving you more customizable starting conditions and therefore builds, but doesn't really introduce any new broad build categories from what I've seen, and it also doesn't change the fact that what you pick at the start basically determines your narrow set of viable builds. One other thing I did quite like from the custom heroes are the weekly runs, where you play as a set custom hero. This is another good source of playstyle variety without making your own custom hero index to try out. I didn't do the weekly hero that often though, so I'm not sure how fun and how varied a lot of the options are. I would consider Hadean Tactics to have a medium amount of progression that is focused mostly on horizontal progression and difficulty levels to climb. Vertical progression that makes you more powerful is basically absent in Hadean Tactics, unless you count some quirks of card unlocks and the custom hero. The first progression system in the game that you encounter comes in the form of unlocking the heroes, and there are 3 variants. You start with one variant of the first hero unlocked, and as you play and get further with each hero, you level up that hero, which in turn unlocks more cards for that hero, as well as the other 2 variants. This same system also unlocks the next 2 heroes. Basically, just play with each hero, progress them to unlock more variants and more cards. This is a fairly quick and straightforward system that never felt super grindy. And now, that same spoiler light warning as before. Again, I don't really consider this mechanic to be a spoiler because the game clearly foreshadows it from the very first run, but skip ahead to the next section if you don't want any light spoilers. There are 2 main forms of difficulty in Hadean Tactics. The first is very similar to Ascension levels in Slay the Spire, and similar mechanics in other games. As you clear runs in the base difficulty, you can start climbing corruption levels, which are character-specific unlocks. Each corruption level adds a specific debuff or challenge to your run. Corruption 1, for example, gives enemies more health, while Corruption 2 makes elite enemies spawn more often. The base game is honestly pretty easy, so I found myself climbing up these corruption levels pretty quickly, and I liked the challenges that they posed. Separate and parallel to the system is the ability to lock the quote-unquote endgame as they refer to it. This makes the 3 circle runs turn into twice as long 6 circle runs, with the 6th circle including the true final boss of the game and a couple other unique mechanics. In order to unlock this full, longer run, you must beat each of the different randomized mini-bosses you can find along your run. Like Corruption, this unlock mechanic is character-specific. You don't actually have to do anything deliberate to unlock this, and you'll get it passively as you do enough runs. I was actually frustrated at times by this mechanic, by trying to get that last boss, even find them, in order to beat them. But they also have since changed the algorithm of how boss sorting works. So you're now more likely to get bosses that you haven't beaten yet in order to unlock them. And I can understand why corruption levels are character specific, but having to regrind this full run unlock for each of my heroes felt kind of useless and annoying to me. One weird quirk of having these 2 parallel systems is that wins in both the long and short mode count the same for progressing your corruption level. So that means the most efficient way to level up corruption is by doing the shorter runs. All successful 6 circle runs have, by definition, completed the first 3 circles. But if you die in circle 5, it won't be counted as a win, and you won't progress your corruption level. You will, however, have beaten the first 3 circles, by definition, which would have given you a win if you've been doing the shorter mode. Does this gaming of the corruption difficulty levels actually matter in any capacity for a single player game? Not really. It makes the achievements a little easier, but it's mostly just a funny quirk that I found. You can also give yourself a harder game mode version in the form of solo heroes in hardcore. Solo hero means that you have only your hero and no other units, but your hero is also stronger. Hardcore means your units are permanently dead if they die in combat, as opposed to standard mode, where your units will respawn with reduced health after each fight. I tried to solo hero a couple times, but I just found it less interesting. And I'm not really that kind of person to try that type of hardcore mode, but it's there if you want it. These modifiers can be added to any difficulty level or run link, so there's a lot of parallel systems at play here that are not that confusing, but interact in unique ways. Very briefly, the custom hero also has its own currency in the form of red gems you get from your runs. You use these gems to unlock more passive abilities and active abilities for your hero, as well as new cards you can use in their deck. You can also get your unlocks for free from a chest you click on that resets each day, very similar to dailies in mobile games and things like that. It's not worth talking about the system too in depth because you start overflowing with these red gems and that currency very quickly, and it's really easy to buy whatever specific upgrades you want without much effort. As a whole, I like the progress system in Hadean Tactics. The unlocks were nice rewards that offer new playstyles, classic horizontal progression, and they also didn't require that much grinding to get them. Outside of my annoyance in having to regrind the ability to do longer runs, do full runs on each of the 3 heroes. The base game of Hadean Tactics is honestly pretty easy, so the different difficulty settings and different game modes are pretty important to add some more replayability. Now let's talk about the story in Hadean Tactics. In this game, you play as a fallen hero, fighting through demons in the circles of hell. Honestly, there just isn't that much story outside the initial world building and some brief background for each hero and their variants. Whenever you complete a run, the game also gives you a brief paragraph about each hero variant, and that adds a little bit more to the story. Basically, Hadean Tactics is a standard roguelite where there's a bit of world building, but not much else story-wise. I liked it for what it was, but it just wasn't that much. So what's my verdict on Hadean Tactics? Overall, I quite like this game. Like a lot of hybrid genre roguelites, I don't think Hadean Tactics is necessarily the best auto battler out there or the single best card game roguelite out there, but it delivers solidly on both auto battling and deck building, and it creates a unique and addicting game that really hooked me for a while. It has nice build crafting elements that are just fun to really play around with and see what you can do, though I do wish they add a couple more broad build archetypes or categories. So if the idea of an auto battler card game roguelite sounds appealing to you at all, I would definitely recommend checking out Hadean Tactics because I think it delivers really solidly on that core premise. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Thanks for watching.